Angela Walker was only 20 years old, a woman whose gentle smile often concealed the storms that raged inside her. On the surface, she looked like any other young woman trying to make her way in the world bright, hopeful and searching for love. But those who knew her closely whispered of hidden scars, of a life entangled with a man whose charm could transform into cruelty in an instant. That man was James Skie. James was the kind of figure who could walk into a room and command attention. He had a way of making people feel like they were the only one who mattered. But beneath his magnetic personality was a darkness that lingered like a shadow. People would later say that his temper was unpredictable, that his words could cut deeper than any knife. For Angela, caught in his orbit, James was both intoxicating and terrifying. The early days of their relationship seemed like something out of a romance novel. James would buy her flowers, take her on long drives, and whisper promises of a beautiful future together. Angela believed him. She wanted to believe him. After all, she had spent much of her life craving stability and affection. But soon, the cracks began to show. His words of love would shift into sharp criticisms. His playful teasing turned into biting insults. And sometimes, his hands, once gentle, became violent. Angela's friends noticed the change in her. She grew quieter, more withdrawn. Her once bright laugh became rare, replaced by a strained smile that never reached her eyes. When they asked her if something was wrong, she brushed it off, saying she was just tired, just busy. But deep inside, she carried a growing fear that James's love was not love at all, but a cage she could not escape. By the summer of that year, Angela's world had turned into a constant cycle of hope and despair. James would hurt her, then beg for forgiveness, swearing it would never happen again. He would shower her with gifts, kiss her hands, and cry as though he were the victim of his own rage. Angela wanted to believe in the man she thought she loved. But every time she gave him another chance, the cycle repeated itself. Each time worse than before. Behind closed doors, their home became a battlefield. Neighbors sometimes heard shouting through the thin apartment walls, arguments that escalated into violent thuds and muffled cries. Yet no one intervened. Some didn't want to get involved, while others simply convinced themselves that it wasn't their business. Angela was left to face the storm alone. One evening, after a particularly vicious fight, Angela stood in the bathroom staring at her reflection. Her eyes were red from crying, her lips swollen from a slap that James insisted she had made him give. She pressed trembling fingers against the bruise, and for the first time, she let herself wonder if she would survive this relationship. Her heart pounded with the weight of the question, but she pushed it aside, convincing herself that leaving James was impossible. He had woven himself so deeply into her life that she could no longer imagine who she was without him. But deep down, something was shifting. Fear was no longer the only emotion Angela felt. Beneath the fear, a small ember of anger began to burn. And as that ember grew, so too did the possibility that one day she might find a way out. For now, though Angela remained trapped in the shadows of James's world, a place where love was twisted into control, and promises of forever carried the bitter taste of betrayal. What no one knew at that time was that this relationship would not simply break Angela's heart. It would eventually cost her life. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. But Angela's life remained trapped in a vicious cycle that never seemed to end. She often told herself that James was just troubled, that he could change if she loved him enough. But love had become her prison, and James was both her captor and her tormentor. James's mood swung like a pendulum. At times, he was affectionate, charming, even tender. He would cook dinner for Angela, play her favorite songs, and make her laugh until her stomach hurt. In those rare moments, she could almost convince herself that things were normal, that the violence was just a mistake that would never happen again. But those peaceful moments never lasted. The smallest spark could ignite his fury. A misplaced word, a delayed response, or even a glance he misinterpreted as disrespect could send him spiraling into rage. He would slam doors, throw objects, and unleash a torrent of insults that left Angela shaking. Sometimes he would shove her against the wall, gripping her wrist so tightly it left purple bruises. Afterwards, as always, he would fall to his knees in remorse, tears streaming down his face as he begged for forgiveness. Angela's friends saw the bruises, though she tried to hide them beneath makeup and long sleeves. They noticed her avoiding social gatherings, her sudden excuses for why she couldn't meet up. Some tried to intervene, urging her to leave him, warning her that this kind of love would only destroy her. But Angela couldn't bring herself to listen. James had a way of making her believe that she couldn't live without him, that she was worthless on her own. Nights were the hardest. Angela often lay awake, staring at the ceiling while James slept beside her. The silence of the room pressed down on her, broken only by the sound of his heavy breathing. She would clutch the blanket tightly, her mind racing with the fear of what tomorrow might bring. Sometimes she wondered what it would feel like to run, to pack her things and never look back. But then she would remember the promises he had made, the good moments they had shared, and that small ember of hope kept her rooted in place. But James's control extended far beyond their apartment walls. He monitored her phone, questioned her about every text message, and grew suspicious if she came home even a few minutes late. Angela felt like she was living under constant surveillance, her every move scrutinized, her freedom stolen. She began to lose herself in the process. The vibrant, hopeful young woman she once was seemed like a distant memory, replaced by someone who lived only in fear of the man beside her. And yet, even in the darkest moments, Angela clung to the belief that things could change. She told herself that James loved her, that his anger came from pain he didn't know how to control, but love had twisted into something dangerous, something that would soon reach a breaking point. Unbeknownst to Angela, James's obsession with control was only growing stronger. What started as possessiveness was turning into something far more sinister, dangerous fixation that would soon lead to choices no one could undo. The cracks in their relationship were widening, and soon the world would see what hid behind the closed doors of their home. Angela tried to pretend that things were getting better. She smiled when James cracked jokes, she laughed at the right times, and she kept her voice soft whenever his temper began to flare. But inside, she felt like a candle burning down to nothing. Every day with James drained her, chipped away at her will to fight, until she could no longer recognize the person she was becoming. James's grip on her life tightened with each passing week. He began insisting on knowing her schedule down, to the smallest detail. If she wanted to go to the store, he had to know exactly what she was buying and when she would return. If she met with a friend, he demanded proofs, sometimes even calling to make sure she was where she said she would be. Angela had stopped fighting back. The arguments weren't worth the bruises, the shouting, or the icy silence that followed. But her silence only fed his paranoia. James began accusing her of things she never did, talking to other men, hiding secrets from him, plotting to leave. The accusations grew darker, more irrational, and the punishments harsher. One night, after a particularly brutal argument, he shoved her so hard that she fell against the edge of the coffee table, leaving a cut across her cheek. James froze in shock, staring at what he had done. For a moment, Angela thought he might finally realize how far he had gone. Instead, he pulled her into his arms, rocking her back and forth, whispering apologies until she could barely hear her own sobs. Angela's family had noticed her pulling away too. Calls went unanswered, visits became rare, and when she did speak, to them, she always found an excuse. She was busy, she was tired, everything was fine. But deep down, she knew they would never believe her if she told them the truth. How could they understand the trap she was in? Love and fear had woven together like chains, binding her to James in a prison without bars. The truth was that Angela wanted to leave. She wanted freedom, peace, the chance to breathe without fear. But James had made it clear in ways both spoken and unspoken. If she left him, there would be consequences. He had never said the words outright, but the threat lingered in the air every time his eyes turned cold. Every time his hand lingered just a little too long around her throat. Angela began keeping secrets of her own. She hid small amounts of money in an envelope, tucking it deep into the back of her closet. At night, when James was asleep, she would lie awake and imagine what it would feel like to run away, to vanish into a new life where he could never find her. But she also knew James. He was obsessive, unpredictable, and dangerous. If he even suspected she was planning to leave, he would never let her go. James, meanwhile, was slipping further into darkness. His jealousy became more violent, his obsession with control more suffocating. He convinced himself that Angela was betraying him, that she was lying to him every time she smiled, every time she looked away. He was losing grip on reality, and, in his twisted mind, he began to see only one way to keep her forever. The walls of Angela's world were closing in. She could feel it in her bones that something terrible was coming, that the life she had been trying so desperately to hold together was about to collapse. But she had no idea just how far James was willing to go to ensure that she would never escape him. The nights grew colder, though the calendar said it was still summer. For Angela, it wasn't the weather that chilled her, it was James. His moods had turned unpredictable, swinging from moments of tenderness to storms of rage without warning. He would hold her one moment, whispering how much he loved her, and in the next breath accuse her of betrayal, his eyes burning with suspicion. Angela felt like she was living on the edge of a blade. She could sense that James was unraveling. Piece by piece, his mind clouded with a darkness that frightened her more than any bruise ever had. He began talking about her in ways that didn't make sense, calling her his possession, insisting that no one else could ever have her, repeating the same chilling phrase, "If I can't have you, no one will." She tried to ignore the words, but they clung to her, poisoning every quiet moment. Even when the house was silent, she could hear them echoing in her head. James was no longer just a jealous lover. He was becoming something far more dangerous. Angela's small attempts at escape became more desperate. She had saved nearly enough money to run, and she even began looking at bus schedules when James wasn't watching. Each plan she formed filled her with hope, but also with dread. She knew that leaving would not be simple. James watched her constantly. He checked her phone, her emails, even the mileage on her car. If anything seemed unusual, the questions came fast, and so did the anger. One night, Angela slipped outside to take a short walk, needing air to clear her head. The streets were quiet, the sky heavy with stars. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to imagine freedom. But when she returned, James was waiting at the door. His expression was calm, too calm, and that frightened her more than his shouting ever had. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost polite. "I just needed some air," Angela replied, trying to steady her hands. James stepped closer, studying her face. "You were gone too long." Angela forced a smile, shaking her head. It was only a few minutes. But James didn't believe her. She could see it in his eyes, the doubt, the madness, the certainty that she was lying. That night, he sat awake in a chair near the bed, staring at her as she pretended to sleep. Angela lay frozen, her heart racing, every breath shallow. She knew he didn't trust her anymore. He was waiting, watching, looking for proof of a betrayal that didn't exist. The following days became unbearable. James's paranoia consumed him. He began calling Angela at random hours if she wasn't in sight. He followed her when she left the house, driving behind her as if she were a criminal under surveillance. Angela felt trapped in a cage that was shrinking tighter by the hour, and then the threat became real. One night, during another spiral of accusations, James grabbed her wrists and pressed her against the wall. His face hovered inches from hers, his eyes wild, his voice trembling. As he said, "If you ever leave me, Angela, I swear, I'll make sure you never leave at all." The words cut deeper than any bruise. For the first time, Angela knew without doubt that James wasn't just abusive. He was dangerous. He was capable of anything. And if she didn't find a way out soon, there might not be a chance later. That night, Angela cried silently into her pillow, her body trembling, her heart pounding with fear. But hidden beneath the fear was a spark of resolve. She knew she had to act. She had to escape. Because now, it wasn't just her happiness at stake, it was her life. Angela woke with a start, her chest heaving, the remnants of another nightmare clinging to her mind. Except this wasn't a dream she could escape. Her reality was far worse. James had grown colder, more unpredictable, and now, quieter. The silence scared her the most. He no longer shouted the way he once did. Instead, he studied her, as if waiting for her to make one wrong move. He began speaking in riddles, muttering about loyalty and punishment, pacing around the house like a predator circling its prey. Angela felt like she was trapped inside a cage that was shrinking by the hour. Her friends had stopped calling James, had frightened them away with his constant monitoring. Even her family had grown distant, their attempts to reach her intercepted by his lies. Angela's world had narrowed down to him and him alone. She thought about running, many times, but each attempt to leave dissolved into fear. James seemed to know her thoughts before she could act on them. The bus schedules she had hidden vanished. The small stash of money she saved was gone. When she asked about it, James only smirked, his silence an answer more terrifying than words. Then came the night that would mark the breaking point. James had cooked dinner, his hands steady, his voice calm, as though he were an entirely different man. He poured Angela a glass of wine, insisting she sit and relax. She wanted to refuse, but his eyes demanded obedience. Every muscle in her body was tense as she took the glass, her hand trembling. "Why are you so nervous?" James asked softly, tilting his head, studying her. "I'm not," Angela whispered, forcing a smile. "Yes, you are," he replied, his grin thin and cruel. I can see it in your eyes. You're planning something, aren't you? Angela shook her head quickly. No, I'm not. I promise, James, I'm not planning anything. But he didn't believe her. He never did. His fingers tapped against the table rhythmically, like a clock counting down. And then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. You know what happens to liars, don't you? Angela's blood ran cold. The air seemed to thicken around her. She tried to change the subject, to calm him, but James's suspicion only deepened. He grabbed her wrist suddenly, squeezing hard enough to make her wince. You're mine, Angela, he hissed. If I can't keep you here, I'll make sure no one ever has you again. That night, Angela didn't sleep. She lay frozen in bed while James paced the room, muttering to himself, occasionally stopping to look at her with eyes that no longer held lovingly possession. She realized something terrible. She wasn't safe anymore, not even for a moment. By dawn, James had already set his plan in motion. He insisted she stay home, shadowing her every move, locking the doors behind them. Angela tested the windows, but he had sealed them shut. Every path to freedom was gone. She was no longer living with a man she feared. She was living inside his trap, and she knew the clock was ticking. Asterisk. Angela's heart had become a prisoner of its own rhythm pounding, racing, crashing against her chest with every step James took. Days and nights blurred into one suffocating loop. She was no longer living, she was surviving. James had closed every exit, silenced every lifeline, and carved his presence into every corner of her mind. On the morning of November 12th, Angela woke to find James standing over her, watching her breathe. His eyes were hollow, dark, and terrifyingly calm. He didn't speak at first. He only smiled a smile so empty it chilled her to the bone. Today's the day, he whispered. Angela's stomach dropped. What do you mean? James leaned down close, his voice a low growl. You'll never leave me. Not alive. Panic ripped through her. She tried to scramble out of bed, but James was faster. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back with brutal force. His strength was no longer human, it was fueled by obsession, by madness. Angela fought, scratching and screaming, but his hand clamped over her mouth, smothering every cry for help. He dragged her into the living room where the curtains were already shut tight, drowning the room in shadows. On the table lay ropes and duct tape, waiting as though he had rehearsed this moment countless times. Angela's body went cold. This wasn't an outburst. This was planned. Please, James, she begged through sobs. You don't have to do this. I'll stay. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt me. But James shook his head slowly, his expression eerily tender, as though he were comforting a child. It's too late for that. You wanted freedom, and freedom has a price. Angela screamed, her voice raw and desperate, but the walls swallowed her cries. James pinned her down, the ropes biting into her skin as he tied her wrists and ankles. Every knot was another nail in her coffin. Her mind raced. She thought of her mother, her friends, the life she would never return to. Regret and terror bled together in her chest, but beneath it all was a sparker, stubborn will to live. With every ounce of strength, she thrashed against the ropes, her wrists tearing and bleeding. Stop, James roared, slamming his hand against the table so hard the wood cracked. His face twisted into something monstrous, unrecognizable. You belong to me, Angela, and if the world won't accept that, then I'll end it myself. The struggle turned brutal. Angela clawed at him, kicked, bit anything to break free. But James's grip only tightened. His breathing grew heavier, his rage consuming him. And then, in a violent frenzy, the nightmare ended the only way it ever could. Angela's voice went silent. The room fell still. James stood over her lifeless body, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his forehead. His obsession had devoured her, and yet, in that moment of victory, he felt nothing, no peace, no relief, only a chilling emptiness. He sat beside her, stroking her hair with trembling fingers, whispering the same words over and over. "You're mine. You'll always be mine." Days later, when the police finally entered the house, after neighbors reported a foul smell, they found James sitting on the floor, unmoving, his eyes blank, his arms wrapped around Angela's body. The man who wanted control had destroyed the very thing he claimed to love, and the home that once held laughter and dreams was now nothing more than a mausoleum of obsession.